Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, as you know, the Nigerian government has been busy for some time now trying to deal with and subdue a persistent security challenge in the north of Nigeria, where an insurgency has been raging in the northeast for more than a decade. But whilst they've been concentrating their efforts on that, another equally destructive form of insecurity, known locally as banditry and involving lots of kidnappings and killings, has been terrorizing the northwest. There have been attacks on civilians, abductions of foreigners, robbery, murder, and the looting and burning of villages. It's led to a good deal of fear and chaos in the region, and has left the Nigerian government and its security agencies struggling to cope. Perhaps more alarmingly, these bandits, several truckloads of them sweeping the countryside, boldly attack not just the people, but the police as well, using weaponry that's often more sophisticated than those of the police. Everything from Rambo-style machine guns to AK-47s and an abundance of rocket-propelled grenades and ammunition. So what's the solution to the challenge of insecurity in a developing country such as Nigeria? Well, my next guest, Cliff Karchmer, is a nationally and internationally recognized law enforcement and intelligence researcher and consultant. In addition to supervising U.S. state local police outreach initiatives for the American Department of Homeland Security, Mr. Karchmer has pioneered investigative and intelligence reform programs for the U.S. Department of Justice and has developed operational guidelines on police responses to a broad spectrum of law enforcement and intelligence issues. And he joins me now from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We really appreciate your taking part in the program. It's still early, reasonably early in the day in Washington, and I know I started speaking to you quite early this morning, so thank you ever so much. And I know you are, Mr. Karchmer, in America, and a lot of your work is focused on that country, but you're also an expert on intelligence and national security and law enforcement reform. I mean, what's your sense of the best way to solve problems of insecurity in a developing country?
The major recommendation that always is made is you need to start with a high degree of civility in order for other reforms to take effect. And the imposition, or as in the case of Nigeria, if I may, the reimposition of civil order is absolutely necessary for anything else to follow from that. And the fact that the condition in Nigeria of insurrection, I will not call it widespread, but of insurrection at this point, means that what has worked in other countries and what the United States has participated in assisting for some reason isn't working in Nigeria. I think that's a lot of what we'll talk about in the remaining half hour.
Well, we're getting your picture clearly and your audio, but might I ask you, Mr. Karchmer, to tilt your screen down a little bit so that we're not just looking at your head. Now you've tilted it. Yeah, that should be about right, I think. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much indeed. And just continuing along those lines, I know you did quite a lot of work in the Ivory Coast, for example. I'm wondering what your experience was in that country and whether or not there are things that possibly could be transferred in that direction, because you advise governments on security and so on, don't you?
Yes, my colleagues worked in Ivory Coast, but I worked closely with them, and I can tell you that imposition of civil order actually was so central in President Ouattara's ascendancy, rightfully, to the presidency after he was challenged. And the level of civil order, I think, is hard to quantify, but it is a level or so or two greater than in Nigeria. And for that reason, he has been able to utilize the recommendations of my colleagues to further stabilize the country and, frankly, to develop an intelligence and counterterrorism program that will ensure the sustenance of democracy. That must be done. In Nigeria, you have a constitution, you follow, in many respects, the British system. I have to question whether democracy is really working in the northern parts of your country. Problems persist. In other words, is it really a democracy if people are afraid and terrified of either ideological or non-ideological types of crime? That's very serious.
Oh, yes, but I mean, the key point really is that wherever you have insecurity, I mean, you had it in sort of Northern Ireland for a very long time.
Yes.
There was a form of democracy in place, but then the people who perpetuate the crimes usually operate outside democratic norms. What I'm looking for is the potential way.
Let me follow that point. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Let me follow that point about Northern Ireland, which is very important and has to do with the sharing of power, which was what the IRA and other legitimate Catholic aspirations were in Northern Ireland. The eventual solution came down to whether there would be effective power sharing. That promoted the democratic principle and advanced democratic theory in Northern Ireland. What you have in Nigeria are, I might say, illegitimate, violence-prone extremists, and you cannot invite them into a government. So it's not that Northern Ireland is a more developed country, more modern country. It is that there are persistent endemic problems in Nigeria, not always shared. Let me just make one further point. Colleagues in Jamaica, for example, worked in the slums where there was widespread violence and serious police abuses of power, although not to the extent of the shooting and killing in Nigeria. And because of the experience that team brought to Jamaica, that area was pacified. So there are analogs and similar situations from which we draw viable conclusions.
I appreciate your giving us those examples, but I mean, what were the solutions? What did they actually do to stop the incidence of crime in those places?
Well, first of all, you have to start with the police department you have. Let me leave Northern Ireland. That was a political solution. In Jamaica, it was more of a administrative, sort of bureaucratic, police-oriented solution. But you start with empowering the community to engage more productively and positively with police. You arrange police-citizen meetings frequently, and the police, under a reformed superintendent or commissioner, or it would be analogous to perhaps the general that you have, who have the line authority to determine what police do in their productive time when they're not responding to calls. Those police in Jamaica engaged with the community, began programs of what we in the United States, I know you've heard this, community policing, and began to embrace the police as the solution, not the problem that it had been. And by all reports, it was a successful effort.
Well, in the context of a country like Nigeria, which has not just the issues of just sort of rampant crime and banditry in one section of the country, and then also has an insurgency raging in another part of Nigeria. I mean, how important is intelligence gathering? You're an intelligence sort of expert. How important is intelligence gathering to national security in a country like that?
Intelligence is absolutely critical. What you find, however, and there's usually a however, so you don't paint a problem with one brush that does not turn out to be responsive. What you have with insurgencies, in some cases, I cannot speak for Boko Haram, but the organized banditry, you have organizations that are more clusters of like-minded individuals than hierarchies taking their dogma from a central organ such as the Communist Party or the KGB, something like that. And when you have clusters of problems that are led by individuals sort of at the center, you have to find out and determine through intelligence gathering and analysis who is at the center, how many such organizations do you have, what are their sizes, because participants, as in armed robbery and so forth, come and go. And you have to figure out with the higher, you create an order of who is most serious and must be taken out first, and then second, and then third. And what you do essentially, and I'll zoom to the bottom line now, you must drive them in terms of leadership and the numbers of groups and numbers of individual in-groups beneath a critical mass. Very important concept. We can't quantify it. How do you know you've reached critical mass? Because order begins to return, or people begin good citizens can go out freely socially and in commerce and not be threatened as they were before. So that's absolutely essential. I mentioned this cluster organization of these kinds of groups because most intelligence organizations that focus on national security have dealt with hierarchical organizations, essentially large bureaucracies like the KGB, like in many cases the central, originally the central headquarters operation of Boko Haram. And not Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, excuse me, Al-Qaeda. And so an alternative is needed, but if the country doesn't have an effective intelligence operation to start with, they won't be able to do the counting and the organizing and the taking down those clusters of organizations.
Mr. Karchmer, for the moment, stay with us. We're going to take a break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Cliff Karchmer, a US-based expert on intelligence gathering, national security, transnational crime, and law enforcement reform. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, my guest, Cliff Karchmer, is a nationally and internationally recognized law enforcement and intelligence researcher and consultant. In addition to supervising U.S. state, local police outreach initiatives for the American Department of Homeland Security, Mr. Karchmer has pioneered investigative and intelligence reform programs for the U.S. Department of Justice and has developed operational guidelines on police responses to a broad spectrum of law enforcement and intelligence issues. He's testified twice before the U.S. Congress and was the Director of Program Development at the Police Executive Research Forum for 19 years. Gosh, what hasn't he done? And Cliff Karchmer is still with me from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. I mean, that's an extensive CV you've got there. And just to give our viewers a sense of the range of experience you've had with intelligence gathering and police reform and all the rest of that, give us a snapshot of the work you did, for example, with Homeland Security, which is a department that's quite familiar to a lot of people internationally because it was set up after the attack in America, the terrorist attack, the 9/11 attacks.
Yes. Well, for Homeland Security, going back more than a decade, my group at the Police Executive Research Forum, we call it PERF, we developed a series of strategic guides for police chiefs and sheriffs on major issues they would be confronting after 9/11. For example, one on crisis communication. How does the police chief assure the community that they are safe after an attack, that that their police are out there in the streets protecting them. And this requires you might call a sheet of music where not just the police, but the mayors and city managers, governors behind them. Another one was, how do you create a center of operations, technical communications? These days it would deal with social media. How do you keep in touch with the community on an almost a real-time basis during and just after an emergency? And it was not just the 9/11 attacks. We faced in the United States the anthrax problem very soon after that situation, and it was essential to maintain that focus. And there were a number of additional guides that we developed for executives on toxins such as anthrax and ricin and so forth, so that the top level executives would have more of a technical understanding of the problems that they would be facing. And then I also worked with the ICE Department of in the Homeland Security, dealing with the crimes committed by illegal aliens, and we tried to develop programs and processes that would help law enforcement be treated legitimately, going after the most violent criminals, predators, murderers, child abusers, and so forth. And that was resulted in a series of policies and procedures, or as often my group delivered to the government, written guides that are clearly understandable from the chief on down to patrol.
And of course, in considering what to do, considering police reform and the reform of sort of security agencies, which is something that you also do a lot, a big issue that comes up persistently in a country like Nigeria, I expect you probably experienced that in the Ivory Coast and other developing countries, is the welfare of the police. That is absolutely crucial in police reform, isn't it?
It's absolutely essential. I'm so glad you brought this up. In my view, and this is a personal view, the key in the United States to curtailing and, if possible, completely stopping the phenomenon of police shooting civilians, shooting citizens, and as you know, most of them are of color, is that police stress, which has to do with shifts and sleep, and the amount of positive health advice that they don't take has to change. And when law enforcement enters their shift with more of a sense of peace of mind and physical well-being, they can help work to ensure the well-being of the community. That's extremely important. And you may not want to get into this, but as we have seen with the recent COVID tragedy in the United States and elsewhere, law enforcement folks who feel helpless to make any difference are going to suffer breakdowns, and I am afraid, the statistics are already here, suicide among law enforcement is going to increase. We have to stop that.
Well, I mean, the problem in countries like Nigeria is things like their salaries. I mean, where they live, giving them better living conditions, and taking care of their families. And in many cases, in the course of the performance of their duties, if they become disabled or even die, what happens to the welfare of their families and so on. So I think in the context of Nigeria, and you don't have direct experience of this country, but you have peripheral knowledge, the problem is that the security architecture of this country does not appear to have the capacity to react to the current emerging threats that this country faces. And from what I gather, talking to people here, law enforcement people, it was actually designed to protect regimes in power. So when you then add to that the fact that there is also corruption and nepotism and all of that, you can see how the problem kind of mushrooms. I wonder if you found a similar problem in other places where you worked.
Pervasive. And a major problem with what you're talking about, let me again try and zoom to a point, is morale, which has to do with the stature of the police profession in the community, which we have seen is declining because of increasing concern for civil rights and militancy, legitimate militancy within the non-white community, and has to do with the fact that when police feel they are overwhelmed by either crime or disorder, they turn to abuse excessive force. In other words, they're supposed to use minimum force in all situations. When minimum force, for whatever reason, doesn't work, they increase and escalate that degree of force, which sooner or later, often sooner, costs them the legitimacy among the public. That is the hardest element to restore. And so what's happening in Nigeria, if I could just use the example of the shooting of young people who were protesting a few weeks ago, that kind of tragedy can take an incredible amount of time, not just to dissipate and for another generation to come on the scene, but for law enforcement in the aftermath of that to regain the confidence of police. May I say again, in Jamaica, reports in the Palestinian territories by another one of my colleagues. Further, in Bosnia, we haven't discussed this, creating a police department that with high degrees of civility and respect after that ethnic cleansing and genocidal experience. That has been done. I do not know yet whether the conditions in Nigeria are conducive to those kind of reforms, but those reforms have taken hold, and my best information is they are persisting in the communities in the countries that I've mentioned.
Okay, Cliff Karchmer, I want to thank you very much indeed for the time that you've taken to talk to us. Cliff Karchmer is a nationally and internationally recognized law enforcement and intelligence researcher and consultant, and he was talking to me from Washington. That's it for this edition of this very fraught Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja and Washington, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.